Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'm Dr. Wizdom Powell, and I want to thank you all for joining us this evening for a powerful conversation. This conversation marks the start of a five-part webcast where we will be unpacking and delving into OWN's series, David Makes Man. Each night, we're going to be on Facebook this week and YouTube, and we're going to be coming to you live directly from Connecticut, from New Jersey, from all over the world, even Scotland, to talk with you about each of these episodes. My name is Dr. Wizdom Powell. I'm the director of the UConn Health Disparities Institute and immediate past president of the American Psychological Association's Division on Men and Masculinities. And I'm just your guide that will be walking you through this conversation series, along with an amazing group of scholars, of youth, of parents, and community members as we learn, engage, and discuss some of the things that we see happening in this series. I was really drawn to David Makes Man for a lot of reasons. One, I'm a huge fan of Terrell McCraney, who was the curator of the really amazing movie Moonlight, Academy Award winner, by the way. And unpacking this episode series or watching the series David Makes Man, it became clear to me that there were so many ways that this series is teaching us about men, masculinities, and becoming, particularly among young boys who are growing up in challenging social environmental contexts. So without further ado, I just want to jump us right into tonight's conversation. And I'm going to invite some of our special guests to join us and to introduce themselves. First, I want to welcome Dr. Jacquie Mattis, who is the Dean of Arts and Sciences at Rutgers, Newark. Next, I would like to welcome Dr. Tommy Curry, who's a professor and personal chair of Africana philosophy and Black male studies at the University of Edinburgh, and the award-winning author of The Man Not, Race, Class, Gender, and the Dilemmas of Black Manhood. And last but certainly not least, we are joined by Dr. Jordana Matlin, an urban sociologist who studies all kinds of interesting questions and phenomena around belonging in Africa and the African diaspora and the ways that Blackness operates as a signifier and intersects with gender norms, particularly as it helps us understand aspects of the political economy. So welcome to each of you, and thank you so much for being a part of this conversation. So before we start, I'd like for each of you to just briefly talk a little bit about your work on men, masculinities, and race. And I'll start with Dr. Mattis.
Thank you. And this is a wonderful, wonderful opportunity to be a part of this conversation. So I start by just saying thank you. So the work that I do focuses on African-American and Afro-diasporic, particularly Afro-Caribbean men and women. And I'm particularly interested in how people choose to be loving, compassionate, forgiving, in circumstances that don't necessarily support those kinds of positive outcomes. And so the root of my work is centered in the recognition that we often fail to understand Black men as crucibles of love and care and compassion. And so all of my work centers on how do we begin to pay attention to those aspects of who men are in space, and particularly the most vulnerable and the most marginalized among Black men. How do we have a different kind of conversation?
That is so amazing. And it's one of the most sort of brilliant frames around how we recognize Black men's humanity that I've encountered. You know, I'm a huge fan of your work, and I've learned from you as a mentee. And many people don't know this, but Dr. Mattis is really the reason I'm here today. I mean, she birthed me in so many ways way back when at U of M, when I wanted to delve into the work and the understanding around gender as they apply to Black men. And she said to me, have you really thought about like masculinities, like deeply, and how it affects men's health? And it was from that one conversation that a whole career was born. So thank you, Dr. Mattis, for all that you've given me and to so many others in your network and in your orbit. And next, I'd like to ask Professor Curry to tell us a little bit more about himself.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. So my research focuses mostly on the vulnerability or Black male vulnerability. Specifically, I'm interested in the ways that racialized men become sexually vulnerable and physically vulnerable under modern capitalist patriarchal states and societies. Specifically, how racist regimes lead to a certain form of sexual violence and sexual abuse that we see across racialized groups, be they Black men during slavery, Jim Crow, or even Jewish men or Armenian men in their respective genocides. Much of my work focuses on both the health disparities that Black men suffer, depression, issues of dehumanization, things that we see in other genocidal regimes. I think that serves as a very instructive lens by which to evaluate how Black men and boys suffer under racist regimes in the United States and elsewhere. And largely, my work is trying to reclaim a lot of the humanity that I think that Black men and boys lose in the modern academy, where many of the frames of subculture and violence and even the racist and compensatory tropes that were developed by white criminologists still reigned unchallenged within gender theory today.
Wow. So I hope you all know that Tommy is going to take us to school tonight because he just took me to school in like 30 seconds. Amazing, amazing perspectives you bring. And welcome, Dr. Matlin. So excited to have you here. Tell us a little bit about you and your work.
Thank you so much for inviting me to this incredible conversation with such amazing individuals. So I am a social scientist as well, but a sociologist, interdisciplinary sociologist who is, as far as a background, I'm an African American who grew up much of my life in Africa. And so my thinking has always been transatlantic because of the things that I've seen that were normalized for me at an early age. And so as my research, I focus on Africa and Black masculinity, but African masculinity, because we have to think about Blackness differently. And that's another conversation. But you had said something, Dr. Powell, in the start in your introduction about becoming, right? Mm-hmm. And so for me, I study Black men, not adolescents, but adolescence being a social category, because that powerful, the capitalist patriarchy, right? The norms of breadwinning is something that has been denied to Black men, both in Africa and in the African diaspora. And we talk about informal economies instead of unemployment in Africa. And so I really work from understanding that position of the trying to become, but being unable, lacking means, and thinking about not just breadwinning, but other ways that men connect to being a man that actually, remains rooted in capitalism, as opposed to the more liberatory forms.
Yeah, so beautiful, and such an important analysis and frame to bring to this conversation. The thinking about Black men and boys becoming in the diaspora really brings another layer of clarity and insight about some of the ways in which these issues and incidents are unfolding in the series. And I love that you brought that up at this point, because I think one of the beautiful features of David Makes Man is the imagery. And there's so many ways throughout this series that you see the diaspora being represented and called forward. And so let's jump right in, because I'm so excited to talk about these first two episodes. So episode 1 is David Sky, and episode 2 is Days Out. And we're going to be, through this fluid conversation tonight, moving between those episodes and asking questions, probing questions, while also sharing with you, our audience, some of the clips from the series so that you can get your head wrapped around this content. I also want to mention that we have a public syllabus that's available for David Makes Man. And this syllabus actually includes multimedia content for you, for your family, for your loved ones, for community leaders, for educators to really use or leverage all of the wisdom being shared in this series in ways that map on to data, stories, and songs. And you'll hear a lot about music in this series. So let's start with David's Sky. So this is a really interesting opening episode. One of the things that I know is that we first enter this world, David's world, who's the main protagonist in this series, in a really kind of abrupt way. The scene that opens in this first episode with David in bed, sweltering in the Miami heat. For those of you who are not aware, David lives in Miami-Dade, and in a particularly, I would say, challenged socioeconomically environment, but with lots of love and community and complexity happening, the kind of altruistic love that Jacquie Mattis writes about and teaches us about. And yet we see David sort of contemplating so much as a young person. He's getting up in the morning and he's having to get his brother ready for school. He's having to help him think about how he's going to enter the classroom, right? And so one of the things that I want us to start talking about is what's happening here. How do we make sense of what David is experiencing? Because it's not unlike what we see young boys and men of color face with daily in terms of the responsibility, the very adultified responsibility of getting their siblings together, cooking, cleaning, doing all of those things, while also trying to get to school. He's racing to get to school. And his morning, you know how the Army says, I get more done before 5 a.m. Like David gets more done before 9 a.m. than most adults. So I want to jump right in here and just ask this question. How do we enter David's world, knowing all of the adult ways that he's expected to behave, and keep in mind that he's also a boy? I find that challenge to be pronounced not only among academics and viewers, but just the society. Like our capacity to really hold space for boyhood is so limited. So I want to start our conversation off there. Tommy, why don't you jump in and get us started?
Oh, well, that's a heck of a first piece to begin with. We know the adultification literature. I think we've seen it represented well in social psychology, even with the work of Goff, where people see Black men and boys, right, as less human, as more ape-like than whites and their female counterparts. But I think that at a conceptual and cultural level, the absence or erasure of boyhood is so important because it doesn't allow an ontogeny, a developmental stage that we see for Black men in the United States and elsewhere. One of the things that I pointed out in The Man Not was that we often have frameworks where we see Black men as the brute and we see young Black boys as the baby cub that's inevitably going to become the beast. And in that process of savagery, we don't see any means of reflection. And what I thought was so powerful about this first episode was you see David as a thinking boy, as a young man who is struggling with the process of becoming, that has aspirations, but nonetheless is still trying to mediate a real world. And I think pointing to Sky, the kind of hauntology, right, of a past figure, of a ghost, so to speak, that's giving him guidance and making him constantly confront his behaviors, even when he gets in the fight in school, right, or making bad choices but seems to have no other way out, shows us something very important about Black boys, which is that they're making active decisions about who they want to become. And what I think so important about this is that when you look at the other Black male characters in the series, is that you see different kinds of masculinity, some of which would fit into the idea of compensatory, or what we call compensatory. I don't like that language, but it's the literature, are toxic. But you see David able to both have relationships and choose otherwise. I think that the overarching notion that we have in American society is that Black men and Black boys have one end, and that's ultimately to be dead Black men are criminals and deviants, right? So what you see in this is this active processes of choosing, of understanding vulnerability, of understanding friendship and questioning what loyalty to friendship means, to try to take ethical paths. And when you see the care that David has for his brother, it speaks so powerfully, because the overarching stereotype, despite the data, is that Black men are not good fathers. But you see
Right.
this young boy being both being a parent, but so maternal, right, to his brother. What we usually associate maternalism with, and nobody questions it. It's normal, right?
Right.
He sacrifices himself to keep his brother out of trouble. He helps his mom. He worries about his mother. He wants to protect the family. So you look at the choices that David makes as a young boy, and you ask that question: how is it possible that he could not be a responsible, caring, and loving, Black man? But nonetheless, the situation imposes so much violence on him that I think sometimes it makes it impossible to see that possibility.
That is so brilliant and beautiful. There's so much there. I'm going to just ask Dr. Mattis to jump in here because I could see the wheels turning here. And especially when you talked about, Tommy, about him being a thinking boy.
Yes.
And that is just so powerful because one of the first things that Sky, who is David's, the ghost that you talked about, and we're going to show a recap clip here shortly, but he says today, everything is a choice, right? Like, so they're talking decision making and sorting through a myriad set of complex choices. And already you know that this is not going to be just a trauma porn kind of, series, that we're really going to see, as you said, the depth and range of the humanity that resides in boys and men of color, particularly among Black boys and men. Jacquie, your thoughts?
So I could just say, I echo what Tommy said. So I completely agree. I think that absenting in the public domain of particular visions of Black men and boys and Black adolescents, right? Because the Black adolescents occupy that interstitial space between the moments when we see Black males as less dangerous and the moments when we see them as profoundly dangerous, right? But we don't see images of Black boyhood, as Tommy pointed out, that are genuinely rooted in this recognition that we all begin as children, and children in the most beautiful, vulnerable kinds of ways. And so in addition to the vision of Black boys and Black men as thinking people, the richness of the emotional worlds of David and his friends, and even the members of the community who we're most likely to see as marginal, folks who are involved in the trade. Like there are these beautiful moments when the different characters sort of say, I'm going to keep trying to reach out, right? And there's both a sort of, but I don't want you to, because what you're trying to get me involved in are things that I don't want to get involved in. But there's also a piece of that narrative that's about, I want a connection, right? And we miss those moments when Black men and boys speak from a deep well of emotions, where whether they're speaking out loud or they're speaking behaviorally. And I think among the richest pieces for me of the first episode, that moment when the two boys are sitting in the hallway and they're about to face disciplinary action, and there's this really rich dialogue that's happening as both of them are sort of shaking. Right there, you can see the anxiety. It's in their bodies. It's trapped in their bodies. You can see the regret. You can see the shame, and it's all anchored in this moment where their legs are jumping and their bodies are shaking. And we so often miss those moments for boys who have a rich emotional language, but when they use it, we shut them down. When they articulate their emotions through their bodies, we tell them to control themselves, but we don't listen, right? And so I think one of the things that comes through very profoundly is this rich sort of pastiche of love and shame and regret and desire to connect, and this, as Tommy pointed out, this deep capacity for friendship, for trust, and even in the moment of violation of trust, this effort on the part of these boys to figure out how to cross a bridge towards forgiveness and reconciliation, that we often imagine that they should do it as adults would do, and forget that they are boys, that they're kids, and that they may not have the language to say, I'm sorry, in a way that the other can hear, especially when it's a major violation, right? So I think the thing that strikes me really profoundly in these first two episodes are these, just about every virtue and emotion that you can think of sort of shows up, and shows up brilliantly. But I also am struck by the ways in which, because we are so committed to beastifying Black men and boys, we completely miss the richness and the generosity of their spirits.
So beautiful. Jordana.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you both for those powerful insights. So, thinking about this idea of boyhood, and how much of boyhood is privilege, right? How much of it is a privilege to be a child, a privilege to be a boy, and for racialized boys, that's a privilege that's often denied, right? So there's certainly a stage that we go through, that the body goes through, that the hormones go through, that, right? There's a stage, but then there's also circumstances that enable that to happen, right? And so the consequences are different. And there's so the privilege of childhood, right? Not just boyhood, but childhood, is that the consequences aren't the same for the things that you do, right? You don't necessarily have a fight and get, your entire future could be derailed if you have a mark on a suspension and then you don't get into the school that you want to go, and that trajectory, right? I mean, we see that all the time of circumstances that things become fraught all the time, right? And even the direction that you go to the laundry room to wash your brother's sheets, right? In the morning, and then who are you passing, right? And what does that do if you miss your bus and then you're late, and right? All of these consequences that weigh so heavily that you see. And certainly for me as a viewer, it was emotional, right? It was emotional to see that. It was, I mean, certainly not trauma porn, but it was heavy. So thinking about privilege, thinking about consequences and circumstances, but also thinking about when you have that, right? When you're surrounded by that, it can become a contest of who is on one end of the making those consequences, right? Who is on the receiving end and who is on that acting end. And I think that we saw that a lot, right? With who acts first, who goes first, who gets to speak first, who gets to, right? Who gets to be the active person if you're dealing with these fraught circumstances. And then it can become a tension, right? As Skye was saying, and then David was responding later that, you told me to do this, right? Your idea of being a man, right, was different, and it created a different kind of outcome, right? And but this need to be the actor, right, as opposed to be the receiver, and that's certainly, right, this kind of masculinist idea that you have to act, right, that you have to do something or somebody is going to do it before you. And so just one last thing to think about that is this performative nature of manhood, right? When boyhood is being denied, then how are the different ways that you think you're supposed to act in order to be the man? And I think that's really significant of when that boyhood has been denied or is in the active process of being denied, because it's still being contested. And certainly it's not just that he is thinking, that he's absolutely thinking, he's also dreaming, right? It's both thinking and dreaming to be something, and then it's so expansive, right, that he doesn't have to be ready for something all the time, right? He doesn't have to be ready. He doesn't have to be, he can just be expansive. And so how does that coincide with this very in the present now, the being versus the becoming idea of a performative masculinity? And I think that's something that was really developing in that episode.
Wow, this is so amazing. You guys have already, there are so many threads of follow-up questions I want to ask, but I'm going to save that so that we can bring our viewers along with us a bit more. And we're going to show you a recap of episode 1, just so you'll know exactly what we're talking about. To be clear, you're introduced in this episode to a few main characters, Day or David, who's the main protagonist in the series. You're also introduced to his friend Siren, whose name will come up a lot in today's conversation. You're introduced to Dr. WT, who's the educator at the school that David is attending. You'll get introduced to Siren's mom and dad, and you'll get introduced to JG, who's his younger brother, and Gloria, his mom. So all of these characters kind of enter the picture, if you will, during episode 1. So let's go to the clip now and let's watch the recap of episode 1, and then we'll revisit some of the questions that are percolating in my mind. Go right ahead.
You all right? Rough morning? And don't let Holmes bother you. Fuck Holmes. He mad because his kid's at regular school. You ain't regular, are you? You had Magnet. Yeah, Magnet, that's good. Magnet means you made a choice. It is gonna lead to prep. What, you trying to go to Hurston, Young Brain? Hey, there's nothing down there, nothing at all. People need to see your eyes, Jay. You cannot sink down. Not today. Ain't today your presentation? Yeah. Yeah, stay on top, man, the wall. Keep your head up. Make sure you go first. Stay ready. You got to get it.
Wow, powerful, powerful scene. So many things come to mind here, but I want to fast forward us a bit ahead because David in this scene is on his way to school. He's missed his regular school bus because he's been doing all the things that we were just talking about, getting his brother to school. His brother also is wetting the bed. So he's taking those sheets and washing them or helping him to wash them before his mom, Gloria, finds out because he's really trying not to bring any more trouble to her doorstep. But in this next scene where David arrives at school, we know that he has this really important presentation that he is supposed to give. And it's interesting because Sky says to David, I want you to go first. I told you to go first. And there's a reason he's asking him to do that, I believe, but I'll let us talk more about what you think. But more importantly here, you see David sort of experience what I would say is developmentally normal envy, right? Like of his friend, because Siren is ready. Sky says, if you stay ready, you don't have to get ready. Siren is ready. And he comes to this presentation prepared and he blows everyone away, including David. But David is struggling with a lot of the guilt, shame, and what our brother Claude Steele would call stereotype threat, right? Like that idea that I'm now going to go and confirm this stereotype. Here I am, this young boy from a challenging ecologic context, and I'm coming to school with all these gifted students, and now they're going to find out that I'm an imposter, that I'm not supposed to be here. So he handles that in a really interesting way. And I'm not going to give it away because I'll let you guys unpack it. Tommy, what's happening here?
I think a lot's happening that's very difficult to talk about in a few minutes. I think there's something powerful about Siren's presentation, right? The song that Siren picks as an example puts manhood at the front of how the viewer and the listener is experiencing the scene. The idea that Black men were laborers, and I think it's powerful because This is not the view that we get when we're coming from this from a gender studies lens. Usually, the idea that Black men were workers and laborers that built schools and provided resources for young children to learn, that there was a aspiration that working class Black men had for a better future. And I think we see this when we look carefully at the Browning books that Du Bois wrote, where he's constantly invested in childhood, constantly invested in what young people will become. And I think that was a really powerful illustration, in the song and the lyrics about how working class Black men who were digging ditches and overturning rocks still had that kind of view. But I think David's experience with this is exactly said. It brought about a certain kind of anxiety because, and I think this is what Felicia Rashad's character even said to the principals, that there's a colorism here. Right, David, for the most part, is the Black brute, and he feels that pressure and the anxiety because he comes from the hood. He comes from where academics from the '60s all the way to the '80s said rapists and murderers, Black men who are raised in these subcultural environments, actually are birthed from. So he's fighting that kind of tension. But what I think is really important here is that when he acts out in envy, when he acts out in that kind of fit of jealousy, it also exposes Siren's sexual vulnerability, right? Because Siren is being physically, and it seems that he's also being sexually abused by his stepfather. And see, this is again why I'm so interested in this aspect of Black men and boys in my own work, is that we don't often see sexual vulnerability when we think about boyhood or manhood. Despite the evidence that shows that Black men and boys have very similar, if not identical, rates of rape and sexual victimization in the United States as their female counterpart, and higher than practically every other group in the United States, we cannot get through, right? That part of the trauma that we refuse to see is the sexual victimization and vulnerability. So when David tells Siren, well, I bet he's teaching you other things at night, Siren reacts and punches him. But that doesn't come from a place of dominance. It comes from a place of profound vulnerability and hurt. Because remember, Siren tells David about him being sexually and physically abused. So what we see here is not some hegemonic struggle of masculinity. This is not the compensatory masculinity that we get from hooks. This is a situation where two young boys are struggling with what the world is imposing on them sexually and racially. And together, this creates an explosive situation because they're both vulnerable. And in that violence, you see this reflection, right? This is what Jacquie was saying a moment ago, in that moment when they're facing disciplinary action. You see this profound reflection between two Black boys about, why did I do this? What does this mean? How is this going to affect you? How is this going to affect me? Why? I don't have an explanation for what's happened. But the thing is that they're thinking, and their friendship is the mediation, right? It's mediating how they're trying to actually encounter the problem. So I see David and Siren both engaging in a kind of vulnerability, a kind of journey, and more importantly, a statement about the possibilities that Black manhood has, not because it's fighting patriarchy, but because patriarchal masculinities, Black men, racialized men who are outside of patriarchal and capitalistic norms, have different kinds of resources and different kinds of struggles that they have to mediate to actually live through boyhood, to mediate boyhood and actually become men. So I think it's a profound example of the different kinds of possibilities and the lived realities that racialized men and boys, Black boys specifically as in the scene, have to confront both sexually and in terms of lethal violence that threatens their lives.
So powerful. I mean, your distillation, if you will, the way you broke that down in terms of Black boys and our refusal to see their vulnerability, even when issues of physical and sexual abuse emerge and erupt. And it really, I think, is one of the singular most important threads in this whole series to me, is what happens to Siren. And we're not going to give it all away, but certainly we know that Siren in particular is the embodiment of all of the complexities around sexual orientation and sexual vulnerability that we refuse to talk about. He's the holder of secrets, and not just secrets for himself, but secrets that many Black boys hold and live with and have to reconcile. Jacquie, what are your thoughts here as you look at what is happening between David and Siren in particular? Yeah. How do we understand their bond and what it is they're trying to teach one another and learn, and what they need to learn from one another as well?
I agree so deeply with Tommy. One of the things that strikes me is the need to sort of go back to what the assignment was.
Mm-hmm.
And the assignment was, tell me how you got here, right? Tell me, essentially the assignment is, where do you come from? What is your story? And the profundity of that, right? So it's a beautiful assignment, but it becomes that much more complex an assignment when you ask two Black boys to take that up in a context where no one usually asks Black folks to sort of reflect on their humanity in a way that isn't defensive, right? And it becomes a defensive enterprise for David, because he has to try to figure out, how does he make the complexity of his world full and rich and nuanced to a teacher who gets to judge him and gets to decide on his future, to a classroom full of white students who are going to hear his story in a particular kind of way. But more importantly, how do you do it for yourself, right? And it's that the complexity of that. You see him struggling with, how do I even answer this question, right? And that's part of the beautiful vulnerability of David, is he is trying both to be his teenager self, right, to figure out, how at this developmental period do I narrate and name any aspect of who I am and who I'm evolving into being, but how do you tell the story? And like that, the reality that he comes to, my people come from the dirt. My people come from, and he doesn't mean that pejoratively. Um, my people come from water, right? The fact that he kind of goes there tells you something about how profound this moment is for him, and is for all of the kids in that class. And the stakes are not the same. You can tell that it's not the same for everyone in that classroom, but it is profound for David and Saren. But in that moment of, it's interesting to me that the moment of violation is also a moment of deep connection. So David walks up to the front of the class, he wraps his arm around Saren, and it's in that moment of connection where, when they bend forward, you would imagine that he would say something like, good job, but the hurt, the vulnerability got the better of him, right? And it's a normal thing to happen for anybody, but it becomes that much more profound because it does become a moment of violation in their friendship. And you can tell on the face, and I get it, like watching the faces of these characters is just so important. If you look at Saren's face and you see the moment where his interior world crushes, that his friend has done this to him, which he didn't expect. And the fact that he didn't expect it tells you how much he trusted David, which is, again, part of what it means to sort of embrace how powerful this friendship really is. Whatever they built before was built in this really deep root of trust. And you can imagine what it must have taken for Saren to have told David what was going on for him, right? So you get this moment where Saren looks at him like, not you. You didn't do this to me, right? And he does lash out. And we think about what happens when people live with trauma, because both boys are living with their own unresolved trauma, right? And the trauma is going on still. So what happens when anyone is living with profound trauma? The inability to speak it, to give it a name, to give it a language, to sort of unfold narratively what's been happening to you. In those moments when there are violations, we do act out physically, right? Because it's almost it's the sort of human response to a thing you cannot name. And we see that happening with them. And as Jordana pointed out before, and Tommy did as well, this becomes a moment of discipline. And the response of the school is not to say, in a deep way, this is not either one of you, right? They don't know these boys. The boys know each other, but the schools don't know them. And the teachers don't know them. So they don't invest in that moment of unpacking of, this is not you. Neither of you fight. So something happened here, and I'm not going to let this go into a disciplinary moment. I'm going to think about how to do this differently. So I'll just say this as well. you see the reaction on Saren's face, but you also see that moment of deep regret in David's face, and it's instantaneous, but you see it. And the question is, who was there to help him figure out how to get back to the place of trust? And you see him wanting to do that, but that moment, that really powerful moment between them, I think is a moment where you would want in an ideal world for an adult to be able to step in and say, I see the most beautiful parts of you. I know that this is not who you are. Let's figure out how to make this right. And we don't see that happening.
And what's so real about that, Jacquie, is that that's what happens to boys, Black boys in classrooms every day, right? It is the catalyst, I believe, for that school to prison push out that we see so much with young boys. It's like this, if Dr. WT wasn't there to sort of say, hold on a minute, like, I don't think you truly understand what's happening here. And she's not going to let David just rest on the fact that he is from a community that is socioeconomically challenged. She's asking him, where are you from? Right? Know where you're from.
Yes.
Saren knows where he's from. And in fact, there is a beautiful poem by Matty Stefanonik, I'm going to mess up his name, who used to be on Oprah a lot. This young boy who just had this clairvoyance about spiritual matters, well beyond his years. And he actually passed away. He was pretty sick, so he knew that he was kind of, terminally ill. But he used his voice as a young person to inspire so many. And one of the things he said is that everybody has a heart song. We all have a heart song. And when we hear Saren singing that song, that is Saren's heart song. He is transmuting all of that pain and trauma and like literally spilling it forward for the world to see, but in the way that he knows how. So he's learned a very important lesson, even in the midst of the trauma that he's experienced, about how to tap into those deeper reservoirs of who he is. He refuses to let the abuse define him and to really contain him, which is really, or constrain him, which is really kind of amazing given his age developmentally. And yet what happens is that we get to see both the struggle with that maturity, that spiritual maturity, and then the real developmental realities that boys will be sometimes boys, and they weaponize those things, their emotions, when they don't understand them. So there's just so much happening there. Jordana, what are your thoughts?
There's so much that all of you have shared. I'm still processing it. But a few things that one thing that I find really important is the layers, the sequence that are unveiled to the audience, right? And so I certainly hope that whoever's watching this has already seen it, because it's a process that's unveiled to us. And you get this deep level of signification, and then you get another deep level and another deep level, right?
Yes.
So as David is thinking about his intervention, as Jacquie was saying, this idea of I'm of the dirt, I'm of the water, right? I'm the elements, right? I am universal. And that started with, am I the ville? Am I the hood, right? The territorialness, when you don't have access to that universality. It's then you hold on really tight and aggressively to your little turf. And to be able to have that, again, that expansiveness of I am universal is so deep, right? And so that's one layer, and he's going through this. And then what you think in the very beginning of this scene with Saren jumping up is that he took his place, right? He went first, and David wanted to go, and it ruined his vibe, right? His everything that he was working on. And it's a very, it's certainly the competition and the jealousy, but it's at a very simple layer, and it's not revealed what he said to him until much later, right? And so first we have, and then also with Saren, when he is singing, when the teacher says, oh, you think that this will be easy for you because you know how to sing, and he responds saying, I actually, this is what inspired me, right? So you start with what you know, you start with that power that you were saying that he already has, that he's learned to channel, and then you grow from that, right? And to be able to communicate that and so confidently. I mean, I would be envious if I saw somebody respond to a teacher with that level of confidence at that age. So we have that first layer, and then that second layer, finding out, we think what he said in the principal's office, right? And what he said, what he tells him he said was that, oh, you're white, right? And then you want to be the N-word, right? And so that with the colorism, we already understand that, and that already hurts. Right. So that's another layer, but it's a layer that we understand later with this other trauma, another deep trauma of a different variety, right? With sexual assault, is that he absorbs that fault. And so with this hurt, he also loves. Right. And he communicated, because then it becomes the blame is mine. I mean, either way, the blame was him as far as if he had said what had happened, but he knew the boundaries of, I can keep this between us, but I'm not going to let your secret out to everybody, right? And so then he absorbs it, and as they were doing the scribbling and this moment between them sitting outside, both shaking, right, in their own pain, it was, you didn't have to say that word, right? Because you could have still, it would have been, if you had just said, oh, you think you're white, that antagonized, but you didn't use the word that gets people kicked out of schools. Right. And so you're going to take it and you're going to run with it as I deserved that punch. Right. And so there's that complexity of absorbing out of love, even while you hurt, and in a way communicating to your best friend, I still love you, and to me, that was also an apology. It wasn't, I mean, that they needed to reconcile and heal, but that was also an apology of, and I don't know how much maybe Siren understood the pain that David was feeling and why he would have done that, right? But certainly he was communicating a gesture that was all between them. The teachers had no idea.
It's so beautiful, because that secret language that boys share is in this really powerful episode made visible to everyone. How many times have we been in situations, for those, I mean, people in this virtual room, especially, who have worked alongside and in community with men and boys of color, we know that that access to emotional language, while we expect that people would have it, is a little bit harder for men and boys to access because of all of the social constraints, the way we rear them. And so what we're seeing, though, is a really complex interior life being unfolded, right, in this scene, where there are no words actually spoken between them, but they're having this sort of nonverbal exchange. And it makes me think about how our own awareness needs to be sharpened when we're confronted with young boys and men who have the same sort of challenges accessing the emotional language to tell us about the wounds that they're suffering. I want to move us ahead a little bit, and I want to talk a little bit about another relationship that emerges in this first episode, and it's the relationship between Day and Raynon. Now, Raynon is actually Sky's biological son, and David is not. And it took me a while. I don't know how many of you in this room got that right away. For the longest time, I thought Sky was David's biological dad. And he's not. And we learn that he's actually the father of another young man who's also struggling, I would say, with a sort of double consciousness and has his own sort of process of becoming. Let's talk about Ray and David's relationship. But before we do, we're going to show a brief clip, because there's an interesting moment between Ray and David and JG that I think will give our audience a little bit more context for this relationship. So let's go to that clip. And while we're pulling that up, I want us to just think about sort of the brotherhood dynamics, but also the relationship between Day and Sky as it emerges in this scene and for the rest of the episode. So take a look.
Fast, you're gonna miss out on everything around y'all. Hey, JG. JG, what you doing? You know what they call this area when it was segregated?
Color Town.
Damn. How you know that?
David told me.
David's smart as hell. He gifted.
Yeah, see if I'm alright next time you need me to bust it your ass to your granddaddy's. Walk up. I'm playing.
You playing, brother Dave.
Yo, why you out here? Don't you got a car?
At my uncle's house. There's gonna be a jam over there. Y'all should come. Look. I know y'all some of the toughest little niggas in the ville. But I can't have y'all walk through Overtown unprotected.
We good, man.
Oh, so you don't want my protection?
I know you got more to do besides walk with us. We good, right? It's my hood, too.
You don't. Ain't nothing more important than family.
So we can now, though?
But I told you. I told you I was gonna be reaching out. Jay!
So really interesting aspects of these characters are shown in this one clip, right? We see Ray, who is apparently has something that he wants Day to do. We're not going to say what that something is, but there's something he wants him to do. And Day is saying, you don't even live out here. Why are you here? Don't you have some other things that you should be doing? And there's a kind of code switching thing that's happening with Ray and with David, but in different kinds of contexts. David is trying to blend in to his school context and not be singled out as the kid that's from the ville. And Ray is trying to be a kid from the ville. So it's an interesting dynamic that's unfolding here. Tommy, help us understand what JG and David are up to here. What's happening with this dynamic?
Well, there's a lot. You know, that scene where, you know, David is on lookout first, and Ray first approaches him and says that, you know, maybe he's reaching out so much because he was a single child, and that he's, you know, and he's constantly referring back to family. So there's a link there between Sky and, you know, Ray being, you know, Ray's son, or Ray being Sky's son, and David. But I think what's interesting here is, again, this is the reflexivity that I really do like about David's character, is that David certainly values family. He values his little brother, but he understands the danger that Ray poses, because when he's on lookout because his little brother made a decision to not go home, engage in a fight, and then now they needed someone else, right? Because he fought the little boy that was going to be on lookout. So David's trying to protect his little brother, but at the same time, to protect his little brother, he has to have now a relationship with Ray. And as the scene develops, right, this is why I think this is one of the really most powerful episodes, because as the scene develops and inevitably he meets Ray's uncle, you can see how the uncle recognizes that there's something profoundly different about David, right? That he has a certain kind of intelligence and integrity that allows him to move through the world very, very differently than other people from the ville. But there's a danger with that. Again, this is what I mean about the profound sense of vulnerability. It's the fact that you're gifted and exceptional doesn't mean for Black boys that it translates to a better life, right? And that whole scene, and even episode 2 is a stark reminder, right? That even when you're the best, or even when you have resources, or when you have a certain aptitude, it doesn't translate that you're going to necessarily be socially mobile. And it's this kind of aspect that Ray accepts and sees and respects in David, but at the same time wants to utilize for himself, right? David's trying to stay out the streets. He doesn't want to be part of the ville. Remember in episode 1, the first thing when he told, after he got in the fight and Sky comes back to haunt him, so to speak, he says, look, I'm going home. And then Sky's like, what do you mean by home? This isn't your home. Make sure you understand what we're saying. You're not from here. So there's this constant outsiderness that David struggles with. And Ray very much represents an anchor or grounding into the ville. So this whole conversation is about him having family and an association that locks him into the ville. The attempt of Ray to not only recruit him, but form a relationship with his little brother, but him having to make the choice that he has to take up the slack to make sure that his little brother protected, by at the same time trying to make sure that he doesn't get in too deep, which is that powerful moment when he starts delivering the package, and Sky stands in front of him, and the other guy's looking at him swaying back and forth, and he's like, I'm sorry, because he's forced to make a choice that he wouldn't make. And it's one of the first instances in the series that we see him choosing what is not his real choice, right? So I think it's a profound example of the reflection, the aspirational nature of David, but also the confines of the environment, right? This is not a reactionary engagement, or this is not a deviant behavior. This is actually the Stoicism, right? This is David trying to make logical choices about what's the most beneficial, but only being able to do that in environments that practically any other group of people would absolutely collapse in and find ruin. He still manages to have resources. He still manages to be a vulnerable young boy, and he's still able to think through his situation. So I think it represents something that I mean, even as a young Black boy myself, when you come from impoverished environments, there's a part of the place that you're from that doesn't want to let you out, and it's that. When I was young, the teachers used to tell me I had a chip on my shoulder because I was profoundly agitated about where I was from and I wanted to leave. I see that in David. I see him in taking on those responsibilities. So I think it's a really powerful, and I empathize with the character for that reason.
Yeah, it's so easy. Oh, there's so much brilliance you just shared. It's so easy to not see those things about our boys, but this idea, Tommy, that you raised about environments and their impacts on the choices we make is a point that I'm always making, that environments constrain choice, and environments can facilitate choice. So sometimes what we think is a rational choice, these rational choice models that we use to overlay over criminal justice issues are like, you don't know. I mean, we saw this one episode, David have so many, environmental constraints on his decision making. I mean, it's at every turn. And I love that you said he's forced to make the choice that he would not have made. And that is the case, I think, for a lot of young boys and men who find their backs against the proverbial wall. Another thing that's happening here that I want to get more into is this sort of, it's like almost like a sibling rivalry, right? That's happening between Ray and David. And it's an interesting sibling rivalry that we come to learn more about later on. But in this initial scene, you do see him, these two episodes rather, you do see David and Ray sort of in this interesting relationship with each other, where both has something the other wants or needs, but they're not sure how to gain that closeness, that affiliation, that bond that we've been talking about. Jacquie, your thoughts here. What's going on with Ray and David and JG?
One of the things that strikes me is the in this story, in the entire not only episode but the collection of episodes, we see the same existential dilemma playing out that's the stuff of like the classical texts that we read, right? The idea about fraternal competition is a story of the ages. Like you go back to the Bible, right? It's right there. And so it plays out here, but in this particular space, it's so easily made into a story of something that's anomalous. But this is the human condition. But we do see that effort both for a fraternal bond, for each of them is trying to hold their identities at the same time that they're trying to figure out how to connect with each other. One of the things that strikes me is JG's very boy-like attempt to perform. I talked about before, perform a particular kind of manhood that is tied to being a part of the gang that he sees, these older boys a part of. And he's what, 9? So you see it in the sort of childish way that under ordinary circumstances we could sort of laugh at and poke fun at because he's 9. But you can see the fear in David that this is not the ordinary 9, right? Not because of JG, but because of the context. So that one of the things that this moment does in terms of the challenge between these boys is it locates the power of place and what happens when spaces abdicate their responsibilities to provide the resources that people need to be safe and whole, right? So the fact that you know that in this particular place, this 9-year-old is in deep danger of falling into a crack that he doesn't want to go into, but that he's likely to fall in. But the thing that, as one of the things that sort of strikes me about this moment is also both the names, the actual names of the characters, the fact that Sky is the father of he's not really Day's father, right? But you have Sky, Day, and Ray, and the idea of light and the way that light shows up in different ways in these three boys and men is in and of itself profound. But I think the fact that Day is the result of Sky's prophetic imagination, right? We don't hear about other people who have the same imagination for him. Not in this episode. We hear it later in other episodes. But the fact that he is the cultivated imagination, the dream of his ancestor now, who is Day, and the fact that he's having to hold an image that he doesn't fully understand, and we're all the result of that, right? People imagined us into places where they couldn't even really put the pieces together. And that notion of, I'm trying to get you to a there from a here, that we get the here, right? And it's already complicated. But the there is this sort of place of nuance and joy and of possibilities that nobody can quite put their hands on, but you know that's where you need to be. And David is having to hold a there that is not fully fleshed out, but he can see the light that comes with that, not just for him, but for his family. And he's positioned between generations, even though he and his brother are of the same generation, but he's doing generative work, which as a psychologist, you don't expect a 13-year-old or a 12-year-old to do that kind of work. He's imagining not only his own movement into this space, but he's trying to figure out how to move his brother with him. And his brother doesn't yet have that dream. Right. So that tension of what does it mean for this young boy to hold generational dreams that he's having to define for himself and live out, and the pressure of that, but also the possibilities of that's profound.
So much richness. I'm not even going to commentate because that was like a drop the mic moment. So I'm going to move right to Jordana. And I want you to just sort of help us think a little bit more about the role of kinship networks, you know, in the diaspora, and how in this relationship, this triad, we're seeing all those kinds of kinship relationships being displayed. We have fictive kin, right? The social fathers that exist in every one of our communities, who is Sky, right? And then we have these your play cousins, right? Like the folks who are not really your siblings, but you love on them just as if they were blood relatives. And all of that is happening here. And then of course you have the real biological tie between Day and JG. Help us sort of put this into context.
Absolutely. And absolutely, that was a mic drop moment, Jacquie. Very powerful. Thank you. So yeah, I mean, it takes a village, right? This nuclear family structure, and I mean, we can talk about womanhood too, right? And the burdens of Black motherhood, but and that actually, just as a side, you know, that reminds me of also in the scene when David was at school, that he was sent to see a counselor, and when he took that note home to his mother, she said, you know, they think you're not getting it from me. Right. And so this idea of, you know, there's a deficiency in me, and there's certainly the emotional is connected to the structural. Right. But by having to try to care for him or by providing for him, she's not able to be present. And that's the story, right? And certainly when you get away from those nuclear family structures, because we understand that's not healthy for anyone, right? You then have people supporting you in a different way, and having those kinship roles when they're not real aunties or real parents. So, thinking about this relationship between the three boys, there's the fraternal role, but then there's also very much the protector role. So, right, there's this idea of who can offer the better protection, both in a relationship to becoming and a relationship to being, right? Who can protect me now in the ville? Who can protect me to get out of the ville, possibly, right? And what are these different tensions? And certainly, the first scene that we see with Raynon, as David is walking across to wash his brother's clothes, right, to protect him, so his mother doesn't know, or protect his mother. The first thing you see with Raynon is he's flashing his chains, right? You see all the gold, right, and him showing it off. And there's actually this is another sociologist or anthropologist who does work in Abidjan, where I do research. But he describes a dance called the logobi that men would do in bars, and it's logo dance. They would dance the logos. It was the logobi, right? And this is certainly prevalent, and they see music videos of African American men, and they embody that, and they see it, which that's another layer of complexity, but as liberatory, right? In a way that is a form of escape. But certainly this performative manhood that is mesmerizing to JG, right, as a 9-year-old. That's really mesmerizing of how being cool, right? But he's trying to protect him in a different way. And what Tommy had said about the choices, right, and having a set of bad choices, is he's choosing to protect his brother, but in that he's getting himself into trouble, right? And there's a constant with that relationship of protection, but also with that performative nature. There is having to be more, being more both for, being more than just a boy, being more to protect, being more, but also trying to get out of this, which we know, right, that's often not the solution, but there's this ideology that if I just work hard enough, having to be more, and having to blend in, right? Because we don't want to stand out, as we saw with Raynon's cousin. So there's also that tension of how can I disappear, make myself invisible, but then how can I excel? And how do we play with those two, right? And how does that serve us in different ways? And how might that serve us in different ways if there was more privilege, right? If we were surrounded by different structures, right? And certainly the idea of, standing out is not always a good thing when you're in environments where you're predated on by institutions, by the police, by whomever. Then you really want to blend in, by seeming too loud, seeming disrespectful, whereas another environment is confidence, right?
Absolutely. I know that we're running up against the clock here, and this is always the case when you get brilliant people in a room and you just say go, and then this magic happens. So I want to first of all thank all of our viewers for being with us tonight, and I hope this gives you a taste of what you're in for as we move on to discuss the remaining episodes of season 1 of David Makes Man. But before we go to the Q&A, I just want to thank our guests, Dr. Mattis, Dr. Curry, Dr. Matlin. This conversation has been brilliant. We had so many other clips we wanted to show you tonight, but never fear. We'll be back here again tomorrow night, and we will be picking right up where we left off, learning more about David and Sky and JG and Raynor, and also Siren, and about the complexity of becoming boys in contexts that don't rise up to meet you at your highest intentions for radical healing. So we have about 10 minutes for Q&A. So what I would like you to do is to type all of your questions into our Q&A function, and we will start taking those questions one at a time. And I promise you that by the end of this, you will feel as if we've been prematurely cut off and that all of your questions have not been answered. And that's because there's so much we could discuss, but we'll do our best. And we look forward to having a rich dialogue with you.
Hi, welcome back. I wanted to thank all of you for tuning in tonight for our first webcast discussion of David Makes Man Season 1. Tonight, we unpacked episode 1 and 2. We learned a little bit more about David, about Sky, about Rainan, and about Siren. And we also heard a little bit about JG and David's mother, Gloria. And we learned a little bit more about the struggles that each of the boys in the series are facing and overcoming. We hope that you have enjoyed this conversation and that you will come back and continue on this journey with us throughout the week. The one thing we want to remind you about is that we actually do have a public syllabus that accompanies this episode. We thought it would be important for people not to view the series without some context. So we have wrapped around each episode readings, op-eds, music, art, to help pack some of the themes that are coming up in the episode. We recognize that the conversations are a bit deep and it may take a little while to process, so we may not get as many questions tonight, but we hope that it has given you a little bit of a taste of what we have in store for you. So what is your homework for tonight? Prepare for tomorrow night's discussion. We will be discussing episodes 3 and 4. And if you go to the public syllabus, there is a whole section there for episodes 3 and 4 that includes supplemental readings, art, music, etc. We want you to really understand Day's journey. There is such a pressing moment now for us to think about the issues that are facing boys and men of color in our nation and around the globe. And on the heels of the deaths of Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd, many others whose names we shall never forget, we recognize the need to really dig deep and unpack the deep reservoir of humanity that resides in boys and men of color. And this series gives us that opportunity. We want to thank the creators of David Makes Man, Terrell McCary, all of the other folks who've been a part of the series, the leadership at OWN. I'm so excited to have this series as a tool to teach others about the lived experiences of boys and men of color. And thank you so much. I want to thank folks in the chat who are providing messages and feedback about the webcast. Hello to you. And I'm so glad that David Makes Man writers are listening and also are having an opportunity to hear what people are taking away from this powerful series. You have really cultivated something special. And as someone who has been working in the space and field of the health and well-being of Black men and boys for over 20 years, it is a gift to us to have this series to discuss. So we're looking forward to having you back tomorrow night. We won't hold you. We want you to get some rest. rest and to come back ready to discuss episodes 3 and 4. And don't forget to check out the David Makes Man public health syllabus. You're going to find the URL for that syllabus appearing across your screen right now. And you can also find a link to the syllabi on our social media sites, on Twitter at UConn HDI, on Facebook at UConn HDI, and on Instagram at UConn HDI. We're also posting in the chat a link to the syllabus. So please join us. Come back tomorrow night. We look forward to hosting you. We have some amazing guests who are going to break the episodes 3 and 4 down. And much of the way that you experienced tonight, we have brought the brightest minds to the conversation. And we're so grateful to be in community with you. We wish you a wonderful evening. Take good care of yourself. And we will see you back here tomorrow night. Take care, everybody.